Okay, with this last topic, I think I'm going to wind up the discussion of free will, unless there are outstanding questions that I haven't addressed. Sometimes we are asked whether there are unsolved problems. The way we look at the world, the philosophy of Yiddishkeit, or particular principles of Yiddishkeit, whether they're unsolved problems, and if there are, what we do about them. And I think that in the case of free will, it's a very good example of an unsolved problem, and free will, as you've seen, is absolutely fundamental to Jewish thinking, Jewish understanding. So I'll try to describe to you what the problem is, and then I'll try to show you how it is that we live with this problem that we can't solve. And it's not just that we can't solve it, but general philosophy can't solve it either, although there are two prominent philosophers who think they do have a solution, but the vast majority of philosophers don't agree with them. If you like, I'll even tell you what they say. This problem goes back to the Skeptics, in times of the Romans. And they put the question this way. So far, I'm putting it in modern terminology, but it's their question. So far, we've been describing free will as free from external causation. That was the backbone of the whole discussion. Their attack is this. If you really hold that that's what makes the will free, absence of external causation, that's what does it, then we think that we can show that free will doesn't contribute to understanding why you're responsible for what you do. Remember, we said that free will is important because only if you somehow involve free will in what you do, you're not responsible for what you do. Nothing that you do is good or evil. Nothing that you do is virtuous or vicious. The Torah commands us to do these things. There's reward and punishment wouldn't apply. That's why it was so important. They say, if you think it's free because there's no external causation, then you can't use free will to explain why you're responsible for what you do. And that would be a disaster, because then the whole purpose of insisting upon free will would be undercut. And here's how they do it. They say, look, all you've told us so far about free will is the idea of being free from external causation. That doesn't tell us how it works. It just tells us that there's a certain thing that doesn't interfere. But it leaves the actual working of free will a mystery. We want to explore that mystery. And in particular, we want to describe two possibilities for the truth about that mystery. And the two are contradictories. One, the description is A, and the other is maybe A is not right, which covers everything else. And we're going to show you that if A is right, you can't explain responsibility. And we're going to show you that if anything other than A is right, you also can't explain responsibility. You can't explain it either way. And that's why you're stuck. That's what's called the dilemma argument in English and Latin, and it's what's called a Monoshach argument in Gemara language. So let's take a look. Your picture, they say, of free will is you have a person with desires and hopes and fears and worries and inspirations and values and commitments. He's got a whole psychology. And that psychology is full of motivation. So when you present to him an opportunity to make a decision, all these features of his personality come into play. And he may desire in one way, and he may be afraid the other way, and values may tell him not to do it. All these things are built-in motivations when he comes to the decision situation. But it isn't just that these motivations push and pull him in various directions, and like we would say in physics, is the outcome of the forces that determine what he does. because originally those internal motivations come from external sources. In addition to the desires and hopes and fears and values and all the rest, there's got to be something else called, let's say, the decider. And that decider at least tips the scales. That decider is the one which determines what shall happen. That decider isn't programmed by desires and hopes and fears and emotions and values and all the rest. It's something else which makes the decision. That's why it's mine. That's why it's not the result of external causation. It's because something of me at the time makes the decision. For now, the skeptics ask, how does the decider work? What's its internal structure? How does it work? And they say there are two possibilities. Either the decider operates according to rules, or it does not operate according to rules. Now, it does seem that doesn't leave any third option. Either there are rules or there aren't rules. Right? Art rules leaves anything else open. It could be anything else you like, which is not rules. And the argument of the skeptics is, if you take a look at it carefully, you'll see that if it operates according to rules, then according to you, it doesn't explain responsibility. And if it doesn't operate according to rules, then it also doesn't explain responsibility. And that's why you're stuck. Your free will is not going to help explain responsibility. So let's go through each of the two possibilities. Let's say the decider operates according to rules. So here we are. Pay back the loan or go on vacation with the money. So let's imagine what the rules would be like. Check, first of all, which will give you the most pleasure, and give it a figure. 16 versus 42. And check your fears, which one are you more afraid of? 31 and 14. And check which one will please your relatives more. 551 and 72. And check how much it'll cost. 16 and 104. Check all these things. Okay, I checked them. Now, take all the pluses and add them up. Take all the minuses and add them up. And do the one that has the biggest number. That's the set of rules. Okay? That's a picture of how the decider would use rules to make the decision. The obvious question will be, where did the rules come from? How did the rules get there? You told us that without the decider, your hopes and your fears and your worries and your values and all the rest can't do the job alone, because they're already in place and they were put in place from the past, and they ultimately are traceable out to external causes. So that can't be the job, because it can be free of external causes. So you put in the decider, which is free of external causes. But the decider has content. It's operating according to rules. Where did those rules come from? From your parents? From your schooling? From your reading? From your experiences? All that has external causation. It sounds like if you're going to imagine the decider uses rules, then those rules are going to be in the decider due to ultimately external causation. And since they're going to be due to external causation, you, say the skeptics, you told me that if it comes from external causation, it can't explain responsibility. So it seems like if you take the option that the decider works according to rules, you can't say that that's why you're responsible for what you do. Aha. So the skeptics say that you will now opt for the other possibility. The other possibility is that the decider doesn't operate according to rules. Doesn't work according to rules. So let's picture this, right? I have this thing in front of me, A or B, pay the loan or go on vacation, and I got pleasure and cost and fear and values and everything else, and they all have, numbers and values and all the rest. But the decider doesn't use rules. Doesn't use rules. Well, if it doesn't use rules, it sounds like all that information about my desires, my hopes, and my fears, and all my motivations can't be relevant because the decider doesn't use rules to make the decision. Well, then it sounds like the decision is completely arbitrary. It's just a snap of the fingers, or a flip of the coin, or consulting the random number generator, and if it's even, do one, it's odd, do the other. It sounds like it's totally arbitrary and random. How could a process that's totally arbitrary and random make you responsible for what you do, make you a moral agent, make you something that can be virtuous or vicious, if the essential process of making the choice is totally random? You could put in as a footnote, can we attach a random process to a computer? And so the next move in the program will be dependent upon the latest deliverance of a random number generator? You certainly could. Would that make the computer responsible for what it did? Certainly not. So here's the argument I'm sorry, I kept saying skeptics. I meant to say Stoics. Here's the argument of the Stoics. You got two choices. Either the decider uses rules, in which case you have to ask where the rules came from, and the rules will come from some source ultimately traceable outside, which means according to you, it's external causation, which according to you means it's not really free. Oh, you called it the decider, but upon further investigation, you see that probably isn't a good name for it, because it's just a reflection of some other external causation, and therefore that doesn't explain why you're responsible for what you do. Or you deny that it uses rules, in which case the choice is a random choice. And since it's a random choice, it certainly can't explain why you're responsible for what you do. Either way, you can't explain why you're responsible for what you do. That means that appealing to free will as the source of responsibility is a mistake. That would mean the whole argument we gave, why we are concerned with free will, why we are committed to free will, because without it, there's no moral quality to our lives, is a mistake. It's just a mistake. And that means the system, to a great extent, collapses. Now, that's a very serious challenge. It's a challenge to general philosophy also. Because this idea that free will makes you responsible is something which we have in Jewish sources, but it's also true in general philosophy for many. Not everybody agrees, but philosophy, nothing's agreed to by everybody. For many it is so, and the feeling is we'd like to know how to answer the argument. We're not convinced that that argument forces us to give up on free will, but we'd like to know how to answer it. And today, as I said today, there are two people, Timothy O'Connor and John Searle, who think they have answers, but the vast majority of philosophers don't agree with either of them, and I think they treat it just as an unsolved problem. Questions up to here? I'm expecting an obvious question. Yeah.
Talking about the Stoic argument, the idea is that the responsibility is removed from the individual since all of his decisions are based on external causation, and meaning like all the things that he perceives and understands and so on, it's entirely dependent and determined by previous experiences. So what's...
I would say, sort of. In other words, he's arguing against me.
Yeah.
The Stoic says, I'm not taking any positions here. Please pretend to be Socrates. I'm not taking any position. I'm tracing out the consequences of your position, O Rabbi. Right? And you've told me that responsibility requires no external causation. And I'm telling you, if you start with that principle, you're in trouble. And if there are rules, the rules are external causation, then everything is external causation, and then you, Rabbi, you said, under those conditions, there's no responsibility. So he's really not taking a position of his own. He's telling me I'm in trouble because of the way I describe free will. Does that help?
To get where we're trying to get, yes, we haven't.
Yeah.
The second case where it's arbitrary, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
Isn't that sort of free will, though? I mean,
Well, it's free in the sense of being free of external causation.
Yeah.
That's certainly true. But then the question is, why did we start the discussion of free will in the first place? Why is this an interesting topic for us? Because we feel that only when free will is in the picture are we responsible for what we do. That's why we were so concerned there shouldn't be external causation. Now the Stoic says, okay, for the sake of the argument, I'll follow you. But now, if you cancel external causation, which means that the decider operates in a random way, does that picture of how the decision is made describe to you someone who is responsible for what he does? He has desires and fears and hopes and values and projects and inspirations and all the rest of that, plus a random element that decides on its own for no reason whatsoever, just clicks and you go.
You're saying because it's
If that's what you thought about a human being, would you say he's responsible for what he does? I don't think so. That's where he catches you. He says, either way, you lose your picture of responsibility. You introduced the whole discussion of free will to explain why we are responsible. Your way of looking at free will makes it impossible to explain how free will makes you responsible. That's his. You want to say something?
Not yet.
Okay.
So just to have a clear idea of what are we meaning by responsibility, like at least in a basic sense, perhaps.
Okay, I'm not going to define it. We've been through this already. Why the definitions aren't and any definition.
It's always
It was going to be controversial, but it means that what you do is morally right or wrong. You can be condemned for it. You can be asked to make good on damages. It's appropriate to take damages from a person who commits such an action. Those are the elements of responsibility we're talking about. Well, I'm surprised that nobody wants to ask the fairly obvious question. Yeah?
I mean, I just figure, like, we'll blitz through challenges, because one thing is to say, well, let's say there are rules that are generated internally by the thing itself, but then by what virtue are those rules generated? And it could just be that it's just random, and then you're just stuck either way. So it just doesn't seem like a meaningful
Okay,
challenge.
very good. You've got very good. Okay, so let me explain it to everybody else, but I think that's the idea. Someone will say, "Listen, Rabbi, you're taking two extreme positions, forgetting that there's a middle. One extreme position is you've got rules, and you trace the rules to external causation, and the other is you have no rules at all. Why don't you understand that rules are affected by external causation, but they aren't totally programmed by external causation? The external causation affects the rules that you have, and then the person is conscious of the rules and makes decisions how to operate the rules, which rules are more important than other rules, maybe to change the definition of the rules. Why not see the rules that you're operating at any particular time as a result of a double input? The external causation, which presents rules, and the internal understanding and evaluation and manipulation of them on the basis of the free will that you have. Then you would have the best of two worlds. There is some external causation, but not total. And you would have crafted the ultimate rules that you're operating by, and that way it's not random. That doesn't work, and the reason it doesn't work is this. He just said it, because if I look at the process now, well, I have teachers and what I read and what I see, and they say, well, you know, it's a good thing to help your friends, and it's a good thing to maintain sobriety, because otherwise you can't make good decisions. I get certain rules, and then I think, well, let's see, it's the Passover Seder, and it says to drink 4 cups of wine. Should I do that? Shouldn't I do that? But then that's a mitzvah. So let's see, the rule, maintain sobriety, or Purim, maybe not all the time. So I'll change that rule. I'll make that rule, a little different and say, there are exceptions. The rules that I have now are the result of a process of receiving input and also analyzing, evaluating, and modifying the input. So it isn't totally externally caused. It's partly caused by my own operation on the rules. That picture invites the following question. Okay, there's the external input that's providing some of the rules or some of the material for the rules. And then there's the internal process of evaluating the rules and operating on the rules to change the rules. That internal process, how does it work? Does the internal process of evaluating the rules and modifying the rules operate according to rules? Does it operate according to rules, or doesn't it? Just repeat the same question and the same problematic. If it operates according to rules, then the rules are already in place, then they came from the outside. And if it doesn't operate according to rules, then it's arbitrary. You can't win by splitting the picture into half external and half free, because the very same question will be asked about the half free. Does it operate according to the rules, or does it operate according to the rules? And you get the same alternatives that you had before. So that doesn't help. So the conclusion up to here is that how we have described free will, I keep saying that because there's a whole alternative philosophy which describes it differently, and they think they escaped the problem. The way we've described free will, we can't explain why we're responsible for what we do. Let's say that that's the present state of play. As I said, later, if you want me to tell you what those two other philosophers say, I'll do that. But let's say that's the present state of play. What do we do about this? And there are two ways to deal with this. One of which I want to introduce by putting you in touch with a very general characteristic of, you know what, I'm going to get it, I'll put it in my pocket. Very general characteristic of reasoning in general, and particular of, I've got it, in particular of reasoning in philosophy, what I call philosophical balance. Put this here. Now, let me give you two examples of philosophical balance so you'll see how it works, and I'll show you how it applies here.
What, the markers?
Yeah, the markers are gone.
We'll bring some more. 1 second. It's fine. Let's see if this one works.
Thank you very much. Okay, a little math. Okay, I know some people are fainting, but try anyway. I'll try to make it, not too terrible. Let's say that A equals B. And now let's multiply both sides by A. So here we get A squared, and here we get AB. And now let's subtract B squared from both sides. We do the same thing to two sides of an equation, then it remains equal. So you got A squared minus B squared equals AB minus B squared. Now we can factor. Here you got two B's. You can take the B's out and you get B times A minus B. And here you have something which you might not be familiar, and if you like, I'll explain how it works. But here, A squared minus B squared is A plus B times A minus B. That's the same as A squared minus B squared. Right? Because the cross products cancel out. Okay, fine. Now, let's divide both sides by A minus B. You divide by this and divide by this, and you get A plus B equals B. Okay, but now A and B are the same, so that could be B plus B equals B, which is 2B equals B. If you divide both sides by B, you get 2 equals 1. So 2 equals 1. Pure math. Thank you. Thank you. You can pay me later. Now, here's the first question. You look at this and you say, golly, this is math. I mean, A equals B, multiply both sides by B, subtract B side from both sides, factor, divide by the same number on both sides, add them together, 2 equals 1. Wow. Guess what? I never would have guessed it, but 2 equals 1. Is that how you would conclude? You look at it, you can't find any mistakes? I don't think so. I think what you say is 2 doesn't equal 1, period. We're not starting with that. I'm not playing with that. There's got to be something wrong here. Even if I look at it for 1,000 years and I don't discover what it is, there's got to be something wrong here. This type of argumentation isn't strong enough to conclude that 2 equals 1. 2 equals 1 is far too absolutely wrong to be overturned by this, even if I don't have an answer. You don't have to follow a proof everywhere it goes. This is the lesson. If you have a proof that leads to a conclusion, and the conclusion is outrageous, you now have 2 choices in logic. You could say, well, golly, the conclusion is outrageous, but what can I do? It's a proof. I guess I have to accept it. Or you can say, the conclusion is so outrageous, I have to bet that one of the premises is wrong, even if I don't know which one is wrong. The proof doesn't tell you which way to go. A implies B just forbids you from accepting A and rejecting B. But when you have A implies B, you could say, well, I believe A, so I guess I got to accept B. Or you could say I reject B, and therefore I'm going to reject A. One person's modus ponens is another person's modus tollens for the logicians. One goes forward, and the other one goes backward. So when you have an argument to a conclusion, you're not forced to accept the conclusion. You could say, listen, this is too outrageous. Now, let me give you another example. Zenos Paradoxes. Zeno argued that nothing moves. Aren't you glad you came to Yeshiva today? You have a famous pre-Socratic philosopher who said nothing moves. Why did he say that? Well, I'll give you 2 reasons why he said it. One reason is this. If things do move, you can imagine a race. And you can imagine a handicap race. You know, a handicap race is where you have 2 runners. One's clearly slower. To make it interesting, you give the faster one a head start. And then you see whether by the end of the time of the race, the faster one is caught up. You give the slower one a head start. And you see whether the faster one is caught up. So let's imagine a handicap race where you have 2 runners. The fast one starts here, and the slow one starts here. Now, the question is, how does the fast one ever pass the slow one? So let's divide the race into stages, said Zeno. Stage 1 is where the one behind, we're going this way, the one behind gets up to where the one ahead was beforehand, during which time, of course, the one ahead gets somewhat ahead, right? So he gets up to here, and he gets up to here. That's stage 2. Okay? Stage 3, the one behind gets up to where the one ahead is, during which time the one ahead gets ahead somewhat. That's stage 3. I bet you can guess what stage 4 is. The one behind gets up to where the one ahead is, and the one ahead gets ahead. Do I have to tell you stage 5? You got it, right? You see how it goes? Okay, tell me, at what number stage does the one behind get ahead? When does he ever get ahead?
He doesn't.
According to this, the stages go on. They never run out. At every stage, the one behind gets up to where the one ahead was, and the one ahead gets a little bit ahead. So he never passes him. That was one argument that if you believe in motion, you ought to believe in a race like this, and I'm showing you that it's impossible for him ever to get ahead. That was one argument that Zeno had. Another argument he had was this. Let's take an arrow. The person shoots an arrow in an arc, goes from there to there. That's what we say. It moved from here to there. Now, Zeno says, I want you to consider an instant in the time interval. This is the time interval. Right? Take this instant. Where is the arrow at this instant? Well, it's at this point. At one instant, it's at one point. When a thing is in exactly one point, exactly one place, it's not moving, is it? Because it's in a particular place, and only in that place. So, at this instant, it's not moving. And guess what? I didn't choose this instant in any special way. So, at this instant, it's not moving. and this instant it's not moving, and this instant it's not moving, this instant it's not moving, at every instant in the whole interval it's not moving. No, so then it's not moving. When is it moving? It isn't moving at any time. Listen carefully, it isn't moving at any time. Is it? Certainly isn't. So it's not moving. Okay. Now, I don't care whether you're convinced by these arguments or you're not convinced. That's not the issue. The issue is this, that the philosophical and mathematical world didn't have an answer for this for 2,300 years. 2,300 years went by before anyone thought that they had an answer to this question. In the mid-1900s, when they invented the calculus on a firm foundation of limits, it was felt by many that they had an answer. I want to know, what did they do for the 2,300 years in between? Did anybody say, Zenos' argument is really pretty tough. People are thinking about it for 2,000 years. Maybe he's right. Maybe nothing moves. It's just math, real simple math. You can explain this in 3 minutes. Maybe nothing moves. Nobody said that. What they said was, there's got to be a mistake there. Sorry. Motion is too basic, too fundamental. We know it too well. There's got to be a mistake there. And, we'll work on it for another 2,000 years. This is what I call philosophical balance. I think the attitude in both cases is correct. When you have an argument, you measure the strength of the argument versus the resistance of the conclusion, and you decide which way to go. There can be differences of opinion which way to go. And sometimes people do agree that no matter how strong the argument is, this kind of argument is not strong enough to overwhelm the implausibility of the conclusion. So now I want to ask, our problem is that no matter how we describe free will, we can't describe why we're responsible. What kind of problem is that? Is that a problem like 2 = 1? And a problem like Zenos paradoxes, where I've reached a conclusion by reasoning, and the conclusion is very unintuitive to me. The conclusion is very difficult for me to accept. What should I do? Should I say, look, I don't want to be just prejudiced and biased. I don't like the conclusion. It seems to me to be, nuts. But I have an argument, so I have to accept it. Or should I say, no, the conclusion is nuts. And the argument, when you look at the argument we're using, it isn't strong enough. It isn't convincing enough. Its foundations aren't solid enough to cause me to give up my reluctance to accept the conclusion. So let's take a look. In particular, let's start with Zeno as a paradigm. Zeno's talking about space-time and motion. How good are we at space-time and motion? Do we understand them pretty well? I think we work with them pretty well. I want you to meet me in downtown Dallas at this and this address, July 27th, 2024. No problem. You put it on your calendar and you arrange your tickets. We're coming from 2 different ends of the earth. We all end up together at the restaurant, exactly at the right time. We're pretty good at space-time. We can have missiles and we can predict where the missiles will go. When they'll land there, we can predict eclipses. We're really pretty good at space-time and motion. Zeno takes space-time and motion and ties us up in knots with concepts we're pretty confident of. And still, we're not going to accept this argument. What kind of concepts are we using here in this argument about free will and responsibility? Well, freedom is a concept, and will is a concept, and causation is a concept, and responsibility is a concept. All of them are controversial concepts. All of them are subject to analysis and interpretation and critique. There's a lot of controversy about them. The materials that go into this argument are very questionable materials, very materials about which we shouldn't feel confident that we understand them and can therefore rely on their conclusions. And you have 4 of them operating in the same argument. It seems to me that we have much more reason to be skeptical of this argument than we have to be skeptical of Zeno, and we're very skeptical of Zeno. So I'm sorry, much more reason. Yeah, right, much more reason to be skeptical. That being the case, one could say, I don't know how to get out, but I'm not convinced there's no way out. The argumentation here is not strong enough to convince me that there's no way out, and therefore I'm putting my bets on there being a way out. similar to the way we put our bets on there being a way out of Zeno because motion is too strong. I think that's one way to live with the problem, with philosophical justification and self-confidence, even though we can't answer it. We understand? Is that move understood? Okay. Then the other possibility is this. This critique is being thrown at us as Jews, as part of the Torah that we believe in. How do we look at free will? In particular, where do we think free will is situated? What faculty of the human being performs free will? Is it, your left toe? Is it the right frontal lobe of your brain? For us, as we have argued in detail, it's the soul. So let's ask, according to the Jewish tradition, is it assumed that we will understand what the soul does, what the soul is, and how it operates? Does the Jewish tradition teach us that we are given understanding of the soul? And the answer is certainly not. Certainly not. We are told that the soul is chelik elokah mimal. Now, if you get out of your dictionary and you're 11 years old, chelik elokah mimal, a piece of God on high. I got it. God's a salami. And you slice them up into pieces, and probably not. But that poetry, a piece of God on high, means it must be pretty high, must be pretty, far from the natural, normal world that we live in, and it is. And our sources say that, of course, we don't have understanding of how the soul operates, in large part because coming into this world and the soul becoming associated with the body blocks out an enormous amount of understanding that the soul possesses. We don't have access to that understanding. Maybe the soul understands, but we don't have access to it. So since our teaching tells that to us, when you have an argument like this which says we're in trouble in explaining how the soul works, that doesn't surprise us, and it doesn't contradict our tradition. Our tradition says don't expect to understand how the soul works. So in that case, we say, you're right, you have a problem, we don't know how to answer it, but we expect there to be problems. And you're just confirming the fact that the soul is beyond what our current intellectual capabilities give us access to. Those are two different ways of living with a problem. Now, let's ask, which one is correct? Is it that some intellectual mistake is being made in the argument itself, like we think about Zeno, or we think about the 2 = 1? Or is it that it's the soul which is transcendent? Well, I can give you half an answer. We could discover that there's intellectual mistake. That we could discover. If we did that, we'd know that it was a mistake, and we'd be able to answer it ourselves. If we never discover that it's an intellectual mistake, then it could still be an intellectual mistake that we didn't discover, right? I hope we agree on that. Or it could be that it's something that the soul does which can't be understood, and we're left with the two possibilities, and we can't decide between the two possibilities. In neither case do we, take off our hats and go eat cheeseburgers. We have ample reason to feel confident that we have not faced an insuperable obstacle to understanding and justifying Jewish belief. That's the way, in this case, we live with this kind of problem for which there is, at present, no accepted solution. Everybody together? Yeah.
So I definitely hear the possibilities that, one, this might be a problem that we could at least more convincingly solve down the line, same way with Zenos Paradox, or maybe this is just a bit of cosmic phenomena that's like totally outside the range. Is there any reason to say that it's actually beneficial for us not to know how free will works? Because, well, that's really all that we are. That's really all the merit that we have. And part of how I remember how Moshe conducted himself in humility was he would meet people and he would never feel above them because he says, I don't have access to like how they're doing in the essence of them. And that was an aid to him to maintain his virtue. So is there any good reason to say that it would actually be to our detriment for Hashem to reveal to us how free will works?
Given the background you're sketching, I would think maybe the thought would be the opposite. The better I understand how free will works, the more confident I am in attributing his virtue to efforts that I can't measure. If I'm in doubt of how free will works, that leads me to be skeptical of free will in general, I would be less inclined to attribute his virtue to his own efforts. So I think maybe there the benefit would be in yes knowing how it works. I think, however, the answer to your question in our terms is if we don't know it, that's because God doesn't want us to know it. So it's got to be to our benefit, but not for that.
Yeah.
Not for that reason. Well, you haven't asked, I'll just tell you, we have about 8 minutes left, briefly how John Searle and Timothy O'Connor get around this, just to show you sort of like where in the distance there could be possibly a way to avoid the argument. Timothy O'Connor says this argument is based on a picture of causation which is incorrect. The idea of causation is one event happens and then it causes another event to happen. The rock hits the window and causes the window to break. You scratch the match and it ignites. Then when you have causation, so then it's a chain of events, and if it's traceable to external to you, then it's going to be something external that forces you, and then you have no free will. O'Connor says there are two types of causation. There's event-to-event causation, and then there's personal causation. I lifted my arm. So you don't take that seriously. You've been trained, sort of hypnotized. No, it was an event in the brain that did it, and that's what you were trained to do. But as a matter of fact, the personal causation vocabulary is very old. The idea of personal causation antedates the philosophical idea as event to event, and he wants to advocate using the two of them. After all, when you say God caused something, you certainly don't mean something in God caused it to happen. Something outside of God caused that to happen in God. It's a chain of things going back into the past. You mean He made it happen. Now, with personal causation, the cause is the person, not an event. And the effect is an event. So when I say He made that happen, and it caused it to happen, that doesn't mean you can go back and say, well, what caused him? Because events cause events, and the person is not an event. Nothing causes the person. The person causes things to happen. So now, when you talk about the decision, you can say that the person caused the decision, and that doesn't trace outside. Because to trace outside would be to go behind the person to find the cause of the person, and then causation doesn't allow that. Causation is either event to event or person to event. But the thing that gets caused is always an event. And here, what gives rise to the free will is a person and not an event, so it doesn't trace outside. That cuts off the tracing to external causation by recognizing a different type of causation. That's Timothy O'Connor. I mean, Timothy O'Connor is a very good philosopher. The other, John Searle, is, I think, in a certain way even more subtle. And he says this, when you talk about something being random and accidental, what you mean is there's no reason for it. Reason is an answer to a why question. It means that when you ask why it happened, there's no answer to why it happened. Well, here too, people have a too narrow understanding of what kinds of reasons there are and what kinds of why questions there are. When something happens, we naturally, given current philosophical prejudices, we naturally think, why did it happen? What's the reason why it happened? The answer is, something caused it to happen. Go look for the cause. But in action, he says, that's not correct. When you say a person did something, and you ask, why did he do it? The right answer is, what was he going for? What was he aiming at? What was his goal? You're not asking for a cause at all. If you simply say, by fiat, all reasons are causes, you're just ruling out free will, just by your definition. You want to say that when it's not caused, it's random? No, it isn't. It's done for a purpose. Why is John working at that job? Because he wants money. That's not trivial. Well, I'm sorry, let me say it a little differently. Why is John working at that job? In order to get money. People work at jobs for different reasons. One is because he wants to in order to get money. Another is in order to earn a reputation. Another is in order to please his father. There are lots of reasons why people. When he tells you he's working in order to earn money, he's told you a piece of information which didn't have to be true. It's a piece of information upon which you can predict his next move. You can predict what he would do if you offered him more money for an easier job. He'd quit and join you. Whereas if he's doing it to please his father, he wouldn't join you. This is a genuine explanation. So the mere fact that it doesn't have a cause doesn't mean that it's random. That's another way out. Both ways out are recommending expanding the concepts that you're using. One is to expand the concept of causation, and the other is to expand the concept of reason. Both are good philosophers, and both present reasons for what they're doing. So this will be a way to avoid the conclusion straightforward. And I think what this tells us is, okay, maybe these solutions don't work because there are certain problems in the way where they're constructed or certain implications, but once you hear that there's somewhere to go, it's very hard to say that if you defeat these two, there's nowhere to go. How would you know there's nowhere to go? Until these philosophers thought this up, people weren't saying that. Who knows what they'll think up tomorrow? To conclude, all doors are closed, it's absolutely sealed, and responsibility is a mistake, is a very, very weak conclusion based on the argumentation given. This gives us more reason to think that there's something wrong with the argument that we haven't found yet. Okay? All right.
Tell us what's wrong with that proof.
Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot to mention that. Yeah. Okay, guys. How about dividing by A minus B on both sides, huh? Let's see. If A equals B, then A minus B is 0. You're not allowed to divide by 0. That's a no-no. That's terrible. Why are you not allowed to divide by 0? No, it's worse than that. Gives you infinity? It's worse than that. Tell me something. 0 times 6 and 0 times 7. What's 0 times 6?
0.
What's 0 times 7?
0.
So they're equal, right? Now divide by 0, and you get 6 equals 7. Forget about infinity. It's wrong on the face of it. Right? You can't divide by 0. That's terrible. Right? But by the time I get to this step, you've forgotten that A equals B, calculate how much is A minus B, and then, okay, fine.
Well done.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I wouldn't want to leave you with the puzzle.